picking this back up. This is still, if you can believe it, chapter 13, part 3. And we're going to start back up with cardiac output. There's few things I still have to say about it, and I want to stay focused on this because I think the number 2 killer may still be the number 1 killer of adults, and I'm talking like over 40, is heart disease. Heart disease is a real problem, and these are all part of why heart disease kills, right? So let's start back up with cardiac output. Cardiac output is amount of blood circulating body in 1 minute time. And why is this important? Because the amount of blood circulating equates to how much oxygen and nutrient delivery, which is important. You have to have oxygen. Why? Because we need oxygen to successfully and efficiently transfer the energy from the food we eat to ATP. And we need ATP for active transport, muscle contraction, yada, yada, yada. We need oxygen. Oxygen needs to be delivered. The delivery system, the supply chain for oxygen is getting it loaded into the blood in the pulmonary circuit and then delivered to all the cells of the body in the systemic circuit. That is our supply chain for oxygen. We have to have a certain amount of oxygen circulating to our cells in 1 minute. And so 5 liters per minute is what everybody kind of needs at rest for their cardiac output. And then it depends on fitness of your heart for stroke volume. And that really determines heart rate, which is how many times does your heart contract in 1 minute, right? We say beats per minute. Stroke volume is just milliliters, or you can do liters. You know, one liter is 1,000 milliliters. So it's just on a metric scale. Stroke volume is determined by the end diastolic volume. And the end systolic volume. So what's left in the ventricle after contraction is the end systolic volume. What you had to begin with is the end diastolic volume. And if you subtract what's left at the end of the contraction, which is end systolic volume, from what you had to begin with, which is end diastolic volume, you get your stroke volume. So that is cardiac output. Next, we're going to talk about mean arterial pressure. Mean arterial pressure is what most people just call their blood pressure. Our blood pressure is our mean arterial pressure. And our mean arterial pressure is the product of cardiac output and what is termed total peripheral resistance. Total peripheral resistance. How much resistance is in that closed circuit? Resistance is something you have to work against. So total peripheral resistance is how much resistance to blood flowing is your heart having to push against. So what determines these things is really The pressure driving blood into the tissues averaged over a full cardiac cycle is your mean arterial pressure. And stroke volume, compliance, which is how elastic the arteries are, these all factor into mean arterial pressure. Frank-Starling mechanism, or what we call Starling's law, states that the more the heart muscle cells stretch, the greater the end diastolic volume. So if I were to say Starling's law, what is Starling's law? There is a mini video on Canvas and YouTube for Starling's law. Starling's law states that venous return determines end diastolic volume. And end diastolic volume ultimately determines how many cross bridges are formed, which determines force of heart contraction, which determines stroke volume. That's actually not what Starling's law says. Starling's law is a little bit more eloquent than that. So if you want to go back and review, Starling's law states that the critical factor controlling stroke volume is preload. Well, preload is determined by venous return. Preload is your end diastolic volume. And why? Because Starling's law states that preload end diastolic volume, the more venous return, the greater the preload or end diastolic volume. The greater the end diastolic volume, it stretches the muscle fibers to optimal overlap of actin and myosin. Optimal overlap means optimal cross-bridging formed. Optimal cross-bridging formed is going to have optimal strength of muscle contraction. So it's all about getting enough blood to fill into the ventricles to stretch the ventricular wall to optimal overlap of actin, myosin, optimal cross-bridging, optimal contraction, optimal stroke volume. And so that's where that stretch equals high-end diastolic volume. There's a second thing that controls stroke volume, and that's the sympathetic nervous system. That's where you get the circulating neurohormones of epinephrine, norepinephrine. They bind to adrenergic receptors on the heart muscle cells, and that is going to increase the strength of contraction, which is then going to increase the stroke volume. So you can increase your stroke volume through sympathetic nervous system activation. So factors affecting cardiac output, changes in heart rate. Heart rate's determined by the SA node. This is your sinus rhythm. That's just your resting heart rate. It's a firing frequency. The SA node fires however many times, depending on what your resting stroke volume is. But the SA node also has autonomic nervous system and hormone adrenergic receptors. And so it can be increased or decrease the SA node for basically increasing heart rate and decreasing heart rate. Sympathetic system takes over, it's going to increase your heart rate. So think exercise, stress, they're going to increase your heart rate. Why? Because you have epinephrine, norepinephrine circulating. Sympathetic activation, increase your heart rate. If heart rate gets too high, though, over 200 beats per minute, there is no time to fill the ventricles with blood. And so heart's contracting, nothing to eject, right? You don't have any blood to eject because it has contracted so continuously that there's no rest time to fill it. And so essentially there's no time to fill with venous return. So it's contracting nothing. So that decreases end diastolic volume the faster your heart rate goes. And that causes stroke volume to decrease and ejection fraction to decrease because both of these are decreasing. So that's no good. Anything that increases end diastolic volume or increases the force of ventricular contraction is going to increase stroke volume. Ventricles generally are never emptied of blood. Usually only 60%, 50, 60% is ejected at rest. If the sympathetic nervous system increases the force of contraction, then that ejection fraction will go up because stroke volume goes up. Stroke volume goes up, ejection fraction goes up. And what controls this, say when you're exercising, is your sympathetic nervous system. Remember, you have these adrenergic receptors that will bind norepinephrine on those cells and increase the quote excitement of those cells. It will increase their contractile force, and that's going to increase stroke volume. So this sympathetic activation you can see at the SA node and the AV node, and sympathetic nervous system innervates. Here it's innervating cardiac muscle directly. So here's where it increases heart rate. At the SA node and AV node, there's an increase in heart rate. Here is where it increases contraction strength in that cardiac muscle. And how does it do that? Well, norepinephrine binds to beta adrenergic receptors. On the SA node, it's going to activate second messenger system, going to increase sodium and calcium channels opening. So threshold is reached quicker than the SA node. That increases the frequency of action potentials, which increases the heart rate. Parasympathetic acetylcholine binds to muscarinic cholinergic receptors. Again, second messenger system, but potassium channels open and that hyperpolarizes, which suppresses the sodium and calcium channels from opening. So you have this hyperpolarization, which means it's harder to reach threshold, which then is going to just decrease the frequency of action potentials. Therefore, you decrease heart rate. So parasympathetic isn't actively doing something, it's passively doing something. It's hyperpolarizing. So something doesn't happen. So frequency of action potentials don't happen. And as a result, the heart rate decreases. Factors affecting cardiac output. Here's where hormonal control factors in. Epinephrine, norepinephrine are neurohormones released by the adrenal medulla, but controlled by the hypothalamus. So it's kind of part nervous, part endocrine. Circulating epinephrine has the same effect as the sympathetic nervous system. It's going to increase action potential frequency at the SA node. And at the heart muscle, directly, it increases the velocity to the muscle fibers. So this increases strength of heart muscle contraction. So both of these are going to increase cardiac output, increasing heart rate, and you're increasing stroke volume. Glucagon can also increase heart rate and force of contraction, as can thyroid hormones and insulin. So these hormones also affect cardiac output by affecting stroke volume. And so this diagram kind of makes it a little easier, right? So these are factors affecting end diastolic volume. Preload, right? That's venous return. And that has to do with filling time. So the lower the heart rate, the longer the filling time. The faster the heart rate, the less time to fill the heart with blood. Atrial pressure. How much pressure is the atria over the ventricles? And then central venous pressure. How much pressure does the system have to deal with, right? This is the afterload. And so afterload is the pressure in the aorta. It's really arterial pressure that it has to deal with, that the heart has to work against. So heart muscle has to work against the arterial pressure afterload. So if you want to increase venous return, so if you do increase venous return, that's going to increase end diastolic volume, which ultimately increases stroke volume. But you can also have sympathetic activity or the release of epinephrine, norepinephrine from adrenal medulla. Either way, both of them can activate the SA node to fire action potentials, increasing heart rate, but also innervates the cardiac muscle itself to increase the contractility. That also increases stroke volume. What is going to affect stroke volume in a negative way is afterload. This can actually decrease stroke volume. So more blood returning to the heart and or increase in filling. You have a higher volume at the end of diastole, you're going to increase stroke volume. So that's here. Stronger contractions eject more blood out of the left ventricle. Stronger stroke volume here. And this is sympathetic activity or neurohormones. Here's where arterial pressure. This is mean arterial pressure or blood pressure in essential, like aortic pressure. How much pressure do you have in the system? So anything that can decrease arterial pressure is going to increase stroke volume. So if you have a decrease in arterial pressure, you have an increase in stroke volume because it's like lifting less weight, you can move faster, you can eject more. But if the afterload goes up, if you start having a high afterload, that is going to lower stroke volume because that heart has to try to get a volume of blood into an already high pressure system. So you're shoving more blood into a closed system that has too much pressure in it. Regulation of heart rate in a healthy person, it's consistent, but if the blood volume drops, like you're bleeding out or your heart gets weak, you've had myocardial infarctions and heart muscle cells have died, that's going to affect stroke volume. Stroke volume declines. In order to maintain cardiac output at around 5 liters per minute, the heart rate has to increase to make up for a lower stroke volume to keep CO the same. And so that's why you see heart rates increase with high blood pressure and lack of exercise and, heart attacks, that kind of thing. Hormone, neurotransmitter, neurohormones, norepinephrine, epinephrine, going to bind to adrenergic receptors. And it's basically going to increase the number of cross bridges. And how it increases the contractility of heart muscle is different than Starling's law. So Starling's law is increase in venous return to heart is going to increase what we call preload or end diastolic volume. The volume then increases stretch of heart muscle cells to optimal overlap of actin and myosin. So have max number cross bridges formed, and that's going to equal force of contraction, right? So you're going to have a big forceful contraction because you stretch those cardiomyocytes to optimal overlap of actin and myosin, form the highest number of cross bridges. And when those cross bridges all power stroke, it's going to form a strong contraction. That's Starling's law. That's venous return. That's blood flow. Hormone, neurotransmitter. Here is where you can increase the amount of calcium being let out, which increases the amount of calcium bound to troponin, which is going to increase the number of cross bridges that can form, which is going to increase the force and velocity of the contraction. And that increases stroke volume. Heart rate is also controlled by the input of the sympathetic nervous system to increase heart rate, and parasympathetic can decrease heart rate via hyperpolarization. And so here, the membrane potential, sympathetic, increase fast sodium channels, which increases depolarization. Parasympathetic hyperpolarizes by increasing the potassium leaving. And so you're going to then slow down the heart rate that way. How we measure cardiac function, there's lots of ways. We do treadmill stress tests. We can do EKGs. We can do echocardiograms. It's an ultrasound that can look at your heart function, the valves, the cardiac wall, and measure ejection fraction, all from an ultrasound. So echocardiograms and ultrasound, it's non-invasive. Cardiac angiography gets more invasive. It's where you thread a flexible tube through an artery or a vein into the heart, and you put this kind of radioactive dye in there, and you have high-speed X-ray videography, and you can track blood flow. And so this can look at blood flow through coronary arteries and look at cardiac function. So these are normal tests. More and more are getting kind of honed and done, or what am I trying to say? I think I've talked too much already. More tests are being evolved to be less invasive, to still get a picture of the functioning of the heart. And then we give people advice like diet and exercise. And that's a whole nother topic. So we're not going to hit that today. We're going to end it here. So I'll see you next time.